Hi everybody. So I want to just chat a little bit about Chapter 4 your reading this week. We're beginning Part 2 of the text, which is Schools and Curriculum. It consists of 3 chapters. The first one, Student Life in School and at Home. Chapter 5 is about Reform, and Chapter 6 is about Curriculum Standards and Testing. So Chapter 4 provides you with a bunch of different topics and gives you a little bit of information on both. Remember, this is a survey course, so you're not going to get a lot of in-depth information from any one of these things. But these are all things that we need to consider in the classroom. We think about what students bring to the classroom. We have to consider that as well, what they have at home that comes with them. The first section of this text really looks at classroom management and really looks at how much wasted time we have in a class with all the bookkeeping and housekeeping duties that teachers often have to do. So there's a real movement for bell-to-bell teaching, which means that a teacher begins teaching when the bell rings and teaches to the end, and we don't have this waste of time of students sort of waylaying conversations and work, or packing up early, and tuning out about 10 minutes before the class is over. You all know people that do that in all levels of work. And so this is an opportunity for me to remind you about your discussion forums, that, if you're packing up early in those discussion forums and not using enough time to really interact with your peers, you're giving yourself short shrift. And so think about that, and think about making sure that you're devoting enough time to your own responses as well as entering into conversation with your peers. And that's where the learning, really a lot of learning happens, this peer-to-peer, collaborative, cooperative work. Your text will talk about a teacher as a gatekeeper and a teacher about dominating the course. In online courses, I fear that when I do these little videos, that it will seem as though I'm just talking at you all the time, and I don't want to do that. But I also want to be able to interact with you. I'd like it best if you could talk back with me, but that doesn't happen in an online course. So consider that what we're kind of doing is a flipped classroom. Flipped classrooms where students do the work that they usually do in the class, the lecture, the summary, the conversation from the teacher. They would do that by watching a video and then do some reading, and they'd come to class ready to work. And so, and if we were a face-to-face class, you'd be watching my video and you'd be reading the text. You'd be coming to class ready to do the 2 discussion forums, which are about tracking and homework this week. And you'd work together in the class to brainstorm and problem solve. But because we don't have that, advantage of coming together face-to-face, we have to come together virtually. And it's asynchronous. And so it's up to you then to really engage in that work of the discussion forums, to problem solve and to talk with one another. And so there is on page 117, it says the teacher is gatekeeper, and I'd like you to really look at that carefully and really think about ways that we can mediate these paradigms. One of it is that the teacher talks for 2/3 of the time in a class. Another is that teachers don't give students enough wait time to answer questions. That a lot of questions ask for specific answers rather than being probing questions. And there are others here as well. And I'd invite you to read that really carefully and think about that. Think about it as you work on your discussion forums this week on tracking and homework, and how that might have some impact on those 2 subjects. So that takes us to the tracking. I have strong opinions about tracking. I don't believe in tracking in terms of putting a student into a niche that they stay in forever. I think there has to be some exploration. So I went to my husband's class reunion, and they had a copy of the graduation program, and each student was assigned a kind of a diploma. So the diplomas were tracked then. So you were in a general course, you got a general diploma. You were in a college track, you got a college preparation diploma. If you were in vocational, you got vocational. The same thing when I graduated from high school. My diploma says on it that I graduated from high school in a college preparatory track. And the thing about these tracks are that if you didn't do a college preparatory track, it's often very difficult to get into college because you don't have the courses you need to do so. So I have problems with that. I also have problems with pigeonholing people. Mike Rose wrote a great book called Lives on the Boundary, where he's a professor at UCLA. And when he was in high school, he was tracked into a vocational track simply because of who he was and where he lived. And it wasn't until one of his teachers discovered that he really needed to be, in doing different things, that he was able to get the courses he needed so that he could go on and excel. So I'd like you to think about that in terms of tracking in middle school and high school, but I'd also like you to think about it in elementary school. We often track there without thinking about it. I remember being in a reading group, and if you were a bluebird, and I was, then everybody knew that you were a great reader. If you were a robin, however, everybody knew that you struggled. So we have to think about those as well in the labeling we do. It's not inappropriate to do ability grouping sometimes, but when it becomes the norm, when classes are stratified, then it becomes problematic. And I'd like you to think about that. And in your discussion forum, if you have heretofore felt that tracking was a good thing, please open your mind to think about what the consequences of that tracking might be, not only for struggling students, but for high-achieving students as well. I would argue that even though most schools will profess they don't track today, that it becomes sort of inadvertent de facto tracking, that particularly in high school, you'll have a group of students that almost all of them are taking AP courses or IB courses or honors courses. You get another group of students who are going to CTE. You get another students who are sort of the art people, the music people. Nothing wrong with having specialties, but the problem becomes when we as teachers or administrators see that child in terms of his or her ability, and don't look beyond that. So I invite you to really think about that this week. There's a profile in education on Jeannie Oakes, who wrote a great book about tracking. I would like to have you read that and have some, maybe that'll be part of your conversation. The other piece is homework. I'm going to ask you to do a discussion forum about homework. And again, going back to the flipped classroom, homework. What does homework look like? Is it work that a student takes home that they have to struggle to understand to do, or do they do this kind of stuff at home, where they are reading and listening to someone do a lecture or demonstrate something, and then coming to class to work, to ask questions, to if they didn't understand something, to get some support with that, to work with their peers? Or is it that we go to a class and we listen to a teacher talk for 2/3 of the times? We might do a few activities, but then we're sent home to do something that we may or may not really know how to do. As a parent, there have been many times when I've had to sit with one of my children and decipher an assignment that they had no clue how to do. So I became the de facto teacher, and I'm sure some of you have had that as well. So we really have to think about what the purposes of homework are. There's some discussion in here about adolescents, two groups, tweens, the middle school and then the high school, and I'd like you to think about those groups as well. There's some discussion in here about the middle school movement, which has been around for quite a while, and the middle school movement, as opposed to the junior high paradigm, was created to sort of help students adjust to puberty. This is a really volatile time in their lives. Their brains are changing. Brain theory tells us that their brains are starting to rewire. It's crazy. They have a hard time remembering things. They can't sleep, or they sleep too much, or they don't hear what you say. They don't remember things. They don't it's just, and we get really frustrated with that. But it's not their fault most of the time. Their brain, the whole brain is being rewired, and all these new synapses are going on in there. So we have to be cognizant of that, while teaching them and helping them to learn as well. We also know that their bodies are changing. They're becoming aware of the other sex. It's just a crazy time for them. So middle school was meant to sort of soften that entry while still teaching them. Now there's been a big movement to get rid of the middle school principal and go back to junior high, where they're seen sort of as mini high school students. And while we still are cognizant of their social skills, social situations, the more emphasis is on academics. So just think about that. We know that in middle school, appearance is really important. Boys and girls, start to be aware of how they look. Entitlement, who's good at what and who's what. Is it better to be a boy or is it better to be a girl? That all these sort of gender issues start cropping up. Homophobia also often raises its ugly head in middle school when students start to become aware of sexuality. There's often a lot of aggression, particularly among boys, as testosterone levels start to rise. Doesn't mean that girls aren't aggressive too, but particularly boys. Lots of discipline issues as students are trying to find their way in the world and their place in the world. And then in high school students are very, very cognizant of their social status. We know that these little cliques and groups. You know, you're popular, you're not popular, you know, you're a motorhead, you're a geek, you know, you're whatever, labels that kids will give one another. But peer relationships are very important to high school students, and oftentimes they'll cite that as being more important than their academics. It's going to school is about seeing their friends rather than learning. And you ask any high school student, I guarantee most of them will say that their favorite thing to do is hanging with friends. And there's also some information about family dynamics in terms of, we know there's a lot of latchkey kids who are going home, parents are working, and at all ages now, very young children oftentimes are letting themselves in. We know that divorce plays a big role here. We also know that there are lots of blended families, single-parent families, families where parents are not married. There's a tremendous amount of poverty, particularly in the state of Maine. A lot of kids are living in poverty, and we are having a growing population of homeless people. These are all important, and they're all things the teacher has to take into consideration for every child in that classroom. You know, we need to know their family situation in order to give them the best instruction we can. And oftentimes we don't discover some of these things, you know, until we've had them in the room for a while. And you know, and it's important to get to know our kids, in other words. And then there are sections on sort of the social ills that happen to kids, at-risk kids, teenage pregnancy, substance abuse, obesity, eating disorders, and suicide. None of these are easy topics to grapple with, but we must as teachers because we see them in our classroom. And I've seen every one of these in my classrooms as a high school teacher. Every one, unfortunately. And we'd love to learn how to deal with them and to support those particular students, but also to be a support for students around them who may be collateral damage in these issues. So that's it for Chapter 4. I just wanted to give a brief overview and just check in with you this week. Also reminding you that Patrick is reading your discussion forums. And if you have questions, you can email either Patrick or myself. It doesn't matter. I'm reading them as well, but he's doing the formal responses for you. So please make sure you're using both of us as best as you can. And if you have questions, please make sure that you ask them, as usual. And your wraps are due this week, and Patrick and I will be looking at those. I'm very excited to see what you've chosen to do for this particular exercise. And I'll be looking forward to talking with you next week and looking at the wraps. So thanks a lot.